Our final presentation for this morning's half of the session is by Dr. Rochelle Marinin. And you may have noticed that we have crossed the state in terms of universities where people are from. So we have University of Florida, University of West Florida, South Florida represented, and now Florida State University. But I'm glad to say that Dr. Marinin got her degrees from the University of Florida, so she's a Gator too. She may not describe herself that way, having been at Florida State for quite some time. Dr. Marinin's specializations are in Southeastern archaeology, as well as archaeology of the colonial period, combined with research on the analysis of subsistence remains from zooarchaeology. And she has a strong focus in student engagement. Through a very long-running archaeological field school at Florida State University, hundreds of students have been trained in mission archaeology over the course of 4 decades. She also has co-authored a series of biographies and a treatise on the state of gender in archaeology, which is a fascinating book that I would call people's attention to, called Grit-Tempered: Early Women Archaeologists in the Southeastern United States. Dr. Marinin.
I think by this time I'm a semi-gator. My involvement in the Apalachee missions began with a phone call and was followed by 20 years of life in cow pastures. So, which is a great thing because there are not a lot of trees in cow pastures. All right, this is a stylized version of the Spanish missions in 1674, and it really looks great, but you can't find them. So I'm going to give you some dates now for Apalachee because our situation is a little different than the East. We were visited by Narvaez and his expedition in 1528. Now, exactly how far west Narvaez got, we simply don't know. We know he diverted to the coast where they basically killed and ate their last horses, where many of them were ill, and where they simply built vessels and to make their way back to New Spain, which they believed was just around the corner. They had a colony at Tampico, and they figured to get there. But of course, they didn't. 11 years later, we have De Soto, and we know that De Soto got well into Apalachee territory. We have the overwintering camp, almost 6 months of time, basically, in the Tallahassee area. Basically in Myers Park, but probably much more extensive than that. We've not been able to find other locations, but the chroniclers basically tell us that that Anhika Apalachee had around 200 houses, and of course the individuals in the expedition took up homes in those. We don't know terribly much about what happens next, to be honest. But we do know that in the early 17th century, friars visiting the area got requests from the Apalachee chiefs, the assembled Apalachee chiefs, to bring missions basically to the area. By this time, I think it's fairly clear that there are things to be gotten, things to be gained by being allied with the Spaniards. But it is quite a long time before missions actually are established. So in 1633 to 34, approximately 7 or 8 missions are established. Mission Patali, which was the first mission I worked on with students, seems to be among the earliest group. In 1647, there was a revolt. We need a lot more information about the causes of this revolt, but at least a good many of the missions were burned and some Spanish individuals were murdered. What can I say? 12 Apalachee leaders were executed and 26 more were sentenced to hard labor outside of the province itself. Now, this is really important when you consider that these are matrilineal people, and when you behead the chiefly elite, you have significant problems following this. But in any event, Mission San Luis, which I'll talk about more this afternoon, was moved from its original location, which we believe was the Myers Park location, and moved to what now is kind of, well, it used to be the western extremity, really, of Tallahassee, but now is pretty much within the city limits, and is built with the assistance, really, of the Apalachees. And here we have an Apalachee town, a mission, basically, and also resettled colonists, essentially, from St. Augustine, who are basically retired militiamen and others. And these individuals are given grants of land. Just how this was managed, it's not really clear to me. But in any way, they began to ranch horses and also cattle in this area. And so we have a large settlement of Apalachees, Spaniards, and one or two religious, the friars, basically. But the good times are short. The founding of the Carolina colony in 1670 is really the beginning of the end. And this is about the time, I think, when we see the Apalachee missions in a kind of golden phase, if you want to call it that. But the slave raiding that will occur now, that's really fostered by the British, will really be the end of the missions in our area. And so we see the first really serious raids in 1702, and in 1704 the last. At this point, Apalachee is abandoned. Some of the groups are able to negotiate by giving up all of their wealth, and one group heads to St. Augustine, where ultimately they are all killed in subsequent raids. Another group moves toward Pensacola, but Pensacola isn't a particularly pleasant place, and so they move on toward the French at Old Mobile, which actually is upriver from the current city. So we have essentially a depopulated area. Now, in terms of the archaeology, in the late 1940s, the first archaeology is done by professional archaeologists trained in universities, essentially. And the outcome of that is this book, Here They Once Stood, The Tragic End of the Apalachee Missions, by Mark Boyd, who is a historian, and two archaeologists, Hale Smith and John W. Griffin, who lived for many years in the St. Augustine area. This is the first document we get, but it does involve historians, because the majority of this document actually is translations by Boyd, and some of the first type definitions of what kinds of things you find in 17th century Apalachee missions. We also have, in more recent times, from the time that Mission San Luis was purchased by the state of Florida in 1983, John Hand became the historian, basically the professional historian for the site, and began to translate things. And I think probably out on the table with books, you find many, many books that John Hand wrote, because he wrote something about just about every group in Florida. Maybe not down in the Everglades area, but he got everybody else, basically. But for us in Apalachee, this book, Apalachee, The Land Between the Rivers, it's really a tough book. I used to require it for students, and I would tell them, don't take notes. It is notes. Just read it for background, because there's so much information. But this is really one of the kind of foundation documents for us now in terms of the ethnohistory of the area. Calvin Jones, a state archaeologist, came to Florida in the 60s. This was a time when Interstate 10 was being built across this area, and it somewhat shadows the Camino de Real. It's an interesting thing. Of course, US 90 did also. When I started, what I basically had to work with was the Here They Once Stood, and reports that were oftentimes, sometimes just little newsletter reports of Calvin's. There was not a lot of information, but Calvin was very generous in introducing me, and my first start, as I said, came with a phone call. A Czech doctor, a physician, and his Swiss wife were buying the Patali mission, which had belonged to the former controller of the state of Florida, and they wanted they wanted to have a relationship with the university for excavations on their property. So they called me and I said no. You know, I was not doing this kind of archaeology. So I gave them some names. I gave them Jerry's name. I gave them Kathy Deegan's name. And he says to me, "We have already spoken to them and they have given us your name." So we began a long-term relationship. We worked at the Patali mission for 12 years, and then we moved to the O'Connell site. I want to just mention this, but I'll go back and talk a lot about Mission San Luis this afternoon, and you'll see pictures. So we have been working in the outlying missions, not in the so-called Western capital. You have two kinds of sites that are possibilities. One are the doctrinas, where the actual friar was resident. They're called doctrinas because these friars saw themselves as teachers, to teach the doctrine, essentially. And so we have those. And then there were affiliated villages, which probably go back to Apalachee affiliations of matrilineages, basically, and use rights of particular regions of Apalachee. And these are called visitas. These are things that he visited, essentially. Now, we don't know where all these visitas are. We don't even know where all of these missions are. At the height of missionization in Apalachee, it is likely that there were about 14 named missions that were in use, in active use. We only know where 11 mission sites are, and these are just mission sites. These are sites that produce the kind of information that we believe that meet our criteria, basically. And one very important criterion is burials beneath the floor of a church. I've worked on 3 sites. 2 of them, I will say, are definitely missions, and the other is not proved at this point because we never found the church and the burials. I have a little red spot here for the Bryan site, which is a new site found by a private citizen, essentially. I guess he graded a driveway, and stuff started showing up. So every once in a while we get a little note from him, "See this new bead I've found," or "See these new potsherds I found," and things of that sort. So this is basically what we know about. And I've worked at this one, Patali and O'Connell. O'Connell is sometimes called Patali too, but we have learned that it can't be Patali 2 based on the artifacts, that it's got to be Patali 3 or 4. So missions were moved. We know of 2 missions that moved and that requested to move, sometimes after about 14 or 15 years. All right, we got involved, as I said, because of this phone call, and we worked at 2 mission sites predominantly. And again, we worked also on Mission San Lorenzo de Ivatachuco. Now, this Ivatachuco is supposed to be the place where they all met, essentially, like the first town in Apalachee. But in fact, I don't believe it, frankly. This is on Ted Turner's property. And he was very gracious to let us work there. But to me, it's not close enough to the river to be the first town. So I'm not quite sure what we've got there, but hopefully work in the future will straighten some of these things out. A lot of times, mission names were given to sites, but we don't really know that that was the site. In the 1930s, Mark Boyd wrote a number of articles for the Florida Historical Quarterly that had to do with missions, and so he had a lot of mission names, and when they found an archaeological site kind of in that area, then it became that mission. And so we have all these mission names, and it's not clear to me, except for Mission San Luis, that we're actually talking about the right place. We also worked on private property of the Castro family. This may be the Mission Santa Cruz de Capoli, also known as Ichutafun, or Deer Town. So these are basically the sites that we worked in. So I want to just talk today about what we've learned, because I think after 20-some years of actual active field work, I think it's a reasonable question. So one of the things we've learned is these are big sites, and you cannot learn about them. You cannot learn enough about them unless you have a lot of lateral excavation and time to do it. So that's one thing I've learned. Second thing I've learned is that unless you have the church and the subfloor burials, you probably have something else. It could be a ranch. It might be one of these visitas. We don't know, for example, if a person dies in a visita, are they taken to the main mission and buried, or is there a chapel or something in their own village? We honestly don't know. We also, I think, have learned that the later mission sites have a complex of structures and that they may be more consistently arranged. And I want to just talk about that for just a moment. This is Isleta Pueblo in New Mexico. If you go look at some of these missions, the Franciscans built very commonly on a 3-to-1 or a 4-to-1 plan in terms of length to width. And as a consequence, when you look at these structures, and here's the one at Gran Quivira, the convento is actually next door, and it shares a common wall right here, basically. Now, these things were built of stone, the Salinas missions, and so the problem of fire perhaps is not as great. So the convento basically is this warren of rooms which include everything from storage to actual turkey pens and things of that sort. I really recommend going out and seeing these things because it's truly amazing. All right, this is the reconstruction of Mission San Luis. Now, we've talked about Wattle and Daub already, but this is not a small structure. It's over 100 feet in length, about 30 feet in width, and it has very definite parts of a church that you would expect if you were in a Catholic church of the 17th century. The Franciscans were preachers, and so an open nave church is what you want. So you see the audience, essentially. We don't have side altars and things of that sort. They're very simple. We have an area over the top for the choir, because in churches of this time period, the choir is behind, and music comes from behind the congregation, which is facing the altar area. Now, in Spanish Florida, at least in the Apalachee area, the orientation of our structures is never due east-west. It's always off. This one is actually northwest to southeast. The Patali missions and the O'Connell mission, those basically are northeast to southwest in orientation, with the main door basically being on the northeast side and the altar being on the south end. Okay, this is basically the reconstruction of the Franciscan complex at Mission San Luis. We'll see this more in the afternoon, but the church is on the left, on your left, the convento, and a detached kitchen actually it's detached, but it does have a covered way, so that you can walk from the kitchen with food into the refectory area of the convento. All right, now, material culture. This is very important to archaeologists because we like things. Things help us identify the time period and where things come from and help us really understand what's going on. So in these mission sites, we know that most of the material is stuff that's made by indigenous people, whoever they happen to be. And I say that because while we start with Apalachees in our province, we get other people resettled there later on. And so when in late missions, like the O'Connell site, I'm not really sure who these people are. I think it's very wise to be cautious about it because it could be a blended group. We simply don't know. So there are a number of things that are very common. Glass beads, they help us a great deal generally to talk about time. One of the reasons we know that the O'Connell site is late is because the glass beads date from either 1670 at the very earliest, but more likely 1690. So a 1690 to 1704 period of time is reasonable, I think. And another thing about the O'Connell site is there's a lot of lead there. So this may be one of the end event sites, a mission basically that was raided, and this may also be where one of the martyrdoms occurred in the past. So we see European-derived ceramics, whoops, excuse me, I need to back up. European-derived ceramics of this sort, glazed basically. We do not have glazed ceramics in the eastern United States until we get Europeans. We have some religious articles, and we have a lot of metals brought in. All right. We know that life was stressful in the missions. We have a revolt, basically, that seems to be promoted by internal stress. But we also have international tensions, too, because suddenly our folks who have been autonomous people are now under the thumb of a very distant organization, the Spanish crown, essentially, and all of its realities, all of its other institutions. And they have really very little voice. We have labor levies. We've talked about those already, John has. We have epidemic disease. Now, if there's any question about epidemic disease, I will show you the results of epidemic disease in just a moment. Dislocation. Guys who are taken, men who are taken to St. Augustine, sometimes never returned. Many of them married, remarried somebody else. Some of them died in places like Wally, complaining that the priest there could not hear their confession because they didn't speak Apalachee. So there are these kinds of things that are very clear. When Calvin excavated at Mission Patali, which again I think is an early mission in our area, he recovered about 67 bodies. We have excavated approximately half the nave of the church and have 150 burials, and then discovered a cemetery outside this area right here, outside the church, also lined up just as if they were inside. And so we have 200 burials, and we have excavated probably half the space, and we never completely saw the end of this cemetery, which I suspect will come right down to here. So this is what epidemic disease looks like. If this is a site that was 15 years in terms of occupation, we have amazing death here. I would also like to point out that a lot of these burials are very small, the burial pits, suggesting that these are children. We are losing mission sites to residences, particularly suburban development. The 3 missions I have worked on, one is lost to partitioning and house building. Another has most of its space also in houses now. And the third is still in family ownership, but there are 4 children. And how that's going to be settled when their mother dies, their father is already dead, but when their mother dies, I have no idea. But most sites in Florida are threatened. All right, so I'll just show you a few pictures of work, essentially. We have a lot of clay in our area, which is a great thing because it has a lot of iron in it, and we can use some sorts of remote sensing to help us see where features are located below the ground. But the overburden, whoops, I keep doing this. The overburden is removed very carefully. These are all plowed fields, so the stuff that's uppermost is all mixed. But this is very good practice for students learning how to handle shovels and trowels and brushes and things of this sort. The material goes from the units basically down to the water screens, which is a quagmire. Everybody hates it in February and sometimes in March because it's cold, you know, and water's always on you. But they love it in April, you know. And then comes off and is air dried basically. And then, of course, you can see the excavation area. I think this was actually the 1995 excavation, but you can see these paper plates basically show you a wall line. And we would not have known whether we were inside the building or outside the building, except right along here is a drip line. So when water comes off a roof, it creates a drip line, unless you have gutters, of course. So we can tell basically that we are inside the building here. So we will be looking for the other side over here. So here's our quagmire. This is 97. We greatly increased our activity. We basically have this pond. It's an impoundment. It's not a natural pond. And we pump water out of it to a big reservoir, big cow troughs, basically, and then pump out of there to the water screens. And we have a kind of a berm made of pine needles. We started with hay, and the cows in the pasture liked that a lot. But so then we put pine straw down, and they did not like that a lot. So we learned. Okay, here's what I'm talking about with regard to the clays. Magnetometry features. This is just a 20 by 20 meter area that we magged. And the magnetometer shows you anomalies in the Earth's magnetic field. So anytime a hole is dug into this clay and the soils are mixed in filling it, we can see this with a magnetometer. So this is what it looked like, just a topographic map of it, and this is basically what it looked like. This thing was filled with the best trash we had seen in 15 years, and that is a fine thing. All right, so this is kind of what it looks like. Just a big hole. I think they dug it to get clay for wattle and daub, and then, of course, when it's open, it's a bit of a problem. So they start throwing trash in it. What we learn, basically, is the trash seems to be coming from the convento and also from a possible third structure that we did not have time to finish excavating. We also could see burial pits. This is what they look like. You can just see these kind of shadows. Sometimes, depending on where we were in the church, at certain times of day, we actually could not see burials. It just depends. It seems as if this church once had a clay floor, not a burned clay floor that's really, really hard, but a tamped earth clay floor, a tamped clay floor, basically, so that it was hard, but it wasn't burned. So when a person died, they would determine the row in which the person should be buried, and then they would dig the grave through the floor. All right. Then they would replace soils, mixed soils now, and then they would seal it with new clay. When the body deteriorated to an extent that the floor slumped, they would put in more clay. And oftentimes those clay caps were still visible. So some of them looked like this, kind of gray, but others were pretty bright orange clay. All right, so these are the features at O'Connell. This is structure one over here that Calvin Jones actually excavated. We went back and tried to delimit and to get him on our grid. This is feature 116, that big hole. So you can see that this is basically the back side of the convento. There's a third structure over here which is not really on this. And we can see that it's filling basically for both sides. And we know this because we can mend the potsherds from various parts of it. They fit together, so we can basically see where they're coming from. All right, this is what it looks like from about 40 feet up. This is 1999, and we were on the northeast end of the structure. This is a wall here. I'm not quite sure what this is, but burials, our drip line ends right here. You can see this drip line coming. It's soils that have been cleared of all organics, so they're very clean looking. And this is basically the organics that were washed out of it, because this is where the drips actually occurred. So we have a wall here, and then we've got this thing, which may be a kind of entryway into the church. It's not really clear. But burials continue right past that drip line and out in here. And this may be a camposanto, a kind of little place. We see this on a lot of the Southwestern missions. And also at Mission San Luis, they continue out beyond the main door as well. All right. So we know also that the Apalachees were converted to Catholicism. And in the process of working at Mission San Luis, they were able to identify Apalachees in Louisiana. And the chief was then Gilmer Bennett. Gilmer just died last year. But they were able to kind of reconnect, really, with the Apalachees who visited Mission San Luis and who we're not really quite sure what the new situation is going to be after Gilmer's death. Okay. So problems. I think my greatest failure in working in mission sites has been My initial intention was to look at the Apalachees in missions and not to go after the churches and conventos and things like that. But you get what you get. And we got a lot of central complex stuff. So I think the thing I really failed at doing was seeing really the Apalachees in the mission. And that's, I think, something that needs to be concentrated on in the future. But one of the problems we have is that we kind of think that we have a really dispersed settlement pattern, that people live, as they say, beneath the bell. In other words, at a distance, but they can hear the bell, and they come for mass or whatever it happens to be, at the behest of the bell, essentially. It is true that in many places, well, I can't say many, I guess I should say the few places we know of, Dave Thomas on St. Catherine's Island, at Santa Catalina de Wally, and actually at a mission site in Joaquina, Florida, that there are a lot of mission bell fragments. And it seems as if when things happen, mission bells are broken. Now, I think the ones in Joaquina, it's really hard to say whether that's a part of the Apalachee Revolt of 1647 or whether it's later, but they seem to have perhaps heated the thing up and then thrown cold water on it, because it is not hacked, it is torn. And I think that's the only way you can do that with a big brass bell. We're talking, like so. So anyway, so I think the domestic life of the Apalachees is one thing that we could spend some time on. Okay. Any questions? Am I within?
You are.
Okay, excellent. Yes.
You mentioned lead and...
I did.
Yeah. I'm assuming, and you said martyrdom, that it might
Right.
be an area of martyrdom. Are you meaning that those were bullets?
I am.
And, okay.
I truly mean that.
All right.
And
Would that have been the Spanish killing then the Apalachees?
No.
Or the no?
I think that what we have at the O'Connell site is an end event site. I think it's a 1704 Carolinian and Creek raid. And this may be where Father Mendoza was actually martyred. Now, I know that there's a lot of lead, and because we have the distribution, we know where this lead is coming from. And when I put that on a map, which I don't have today, but when I put that on a map, it's at the main door of the church. And the Carolinians often say, we invested the church for it. In other words, they go for the main door because people apparently take refuge inside the churches. Mendoza was in the convento, apparently, and was called out by an Apalachee he knew. And when he opened either the door or the shutters, he was shot. And ultimately, his body was determined to be beneath the floor, beneath a collapsed wall and burned. His rosary was what they actually identified. So I don't know whether he's still there. I would love to open that entire area very carefully and see if we can find his ashes, because it's conceivable. But it's also possible that because the area has been plowed significantly, that we may not be able to do that. So, but yes, definitely bullets, these, and spent, not round jobs, spent. There are impacts on them. Yes, ma'am.
Rochelle, the burials, do you exhume them and then rebury them, and are they taken care of Catholic or because they're Native Americans? What happens?
They're still in the ground. The reason for that is the condition the bones are in is kind of like Swiss cheese. You can literally trowel right through a person if you're not careful. So what we basically did was, when we identified the first burial pit, we talked to the Governor's Council on Indian Affairs, Joe Quitone, and we told him that we wanted to open not more than 6 of the burial features. First of all, we wanted to make sure that what we were calling a grave truly was a grave. Secondly, we wanted to find out what the orientation of the person was, because generally burials are made with the heads toward the main door and the feet toward the altar, so that if the person sat up, they would be facing the altar. Religious tend to be buried facing their parishioners, their congregation, essentially. We actually only opened 2. We determined that they were indigenous people, and we determined what the orientation of the body was, and also that the feature was in fact a grave, and we simply closed it. And we often put in clean sandy soil or something like that down right over the body, so that somebody would be they would know that there was something different there. It is also conceivable, because if that is the last location of the Patali mission, that we should find people who were tied to the Stations of the Cross in the plaza and burned and flayed and other kinds of nastinesses. We should find, I think, a mass grave, because they did send people back to bury them. Now, whether they made individual graves, I doubt it, so we would have expected a mass grave. And there is, right now, houses being built in this area, which we never had a chance to look at. So we have a monitoring program, and that's the best we can do at the moment. Yes, sir.
You made reference to the Appalachians' conversion to catechism.
Right.
What were they before that?
Pagans.
Oh, okay.
I mean, they were. All natives had their own religions. They were polytheists. I'm sure, like many, that they had ideas about heaven and hell in some way. I mean, Southeastern Indians, now this is borrowing very loosely, but Creeks, for example, we know a little bit more about, had a kind of tripartite division of the cosmos, and it was like a cake. So you have the things of the upper world, you have the things of this world, and you have the things of the upper world. And so they put plants and animals and people in those categories. We were of this world, and so were deer, which of course are very important. Things of the lower world were things that were anomalous, most likely things like owls, for example, because an owl is a bird, which most birds are in the upper world, but the owl, because it hunts at night primarily, is anomalous. Bats would be anomalous. Snakes are anomalous, those kinds of things. So I suspect that some version of that is what we could have expected prior to the arrival of missionaries.
Oh, and one other thing.
Sure.
Is Bryan, that you alluded to earlier, is that Alabama or is that Mississippi?
No, it's in northeast Tallahassee.
Oh, it is.
I mean, these are all things, all of these are right around Tallahassee. As I said, in the Tallahassee area, there were at least 14 active missions at one time. Now, if you move those missions once or twice during the 71 years of mission activity in our area, you can have 36 sites easily. And right now, we only have 11. My pleasure.
Was there another question?
I just wonder, do we know why did they want to bury them inside the church, under the floor? What?
In Europe, it is not unusual to find subfloor burials, even burials in the walls. And it's not clear to me why, but I will say that mound burial was normal in the past, and this may be more an idea of a sacred space, that they're buried in the most sacred of spaces, essentially. We see this in other places, in the early mission systems, Arizona, New Mexico. California has it for a time and then outlaws it. And so if you go and visit a California mission, for example, Mission Dolores in downtown San Francisco, the people buried in that cemetery are Irish, okay? You don't know, you can't even see Native Americans in the California missions very easily. And I'll talk about that later today, but anyway, the point is that we don't know I was in a National Endowment for the Humanities summer seminar in '93, and one of the members of the seminar was a Franciscan, and he was also an anthropologist. He said that in the summer times he would relieve the priest at San Javier del Bac. If any of you have been south of Tucson and seen that mission, it's actually a Jesuit construction, but it's a Franciscan mission to the Tohono O'odham, and it is active still. So he said that, you know, he would go in for a burial, and he would go to the grave, they would put the person in the grave, he would speak the liturgy basically for the burial, and then he would leave. And he knew that there were other things that went on. But the Franciscans apparently have been flexible about these things in the past. But why this became the norm, I don't know, but it's interesting. But I really think it has more to do with sacred space. The question is, how did the Apalachees bury their dead before the arrival of the Spaniards? I think that we don't know specifically, okay? And the reason for that is we have the Lake Jackson site, which is a 7-mound site just north of town. We don't know what the relationship between that mound is, or that mound complex, and Anhika Apalachee, which is in Tallahassee, which is south of there, some miles. It's not really clear to me. DeSoto, the chroniclers don't really talk much about mounds, and they don't talk about mounds in our area, so it's not really clear. We know, for example, that when some of the Creeks settled treaties with the British or the Americans, that they mentioned mounds and they got specific rights to bury in those mounds still, even though they were being displaced. But it's not really clear to me because we don't have something that's kind of intervening. And also, it's not clear how many people get buried in mounds, whether it's only the elite of society and whether there are other burial areas, cemeteries, that are discrete. At Moundville, for example, we have mound burials there, but we also have cemeteries apparently for warrior class individuals. And so it's possible. I would say that the Lake Jackson site is extremely under-investigated. So it may well be in the future that we'll know more, but right now we don't.